Okay, chapter 50 is just a quick overview of the structure and function of the musculoskeletal system. So in this slide, we're just looking at the general anatomy of bone. We know that bone's a living thing, it's an organ, because it's made of multiple tissue types, and it's dynamic, it's constantly changing over the course of our lifetime. So it's not this dead, solid, static structure. It's living and constantly changing. And there's really two types of bone here. What we find is compact bone. And the reason why it's called compact, well, it's more dense. And then we have spongy bone deep in here, and it's because it has a spongy appearance. Now, compact bone contains what we call osteons. And the osteon is also called the Haversian system. And this is basically the functional unit of bone. What we find is that these osteons are made of concentric rings of bone called lamella, and the center of this osteon is called the central canal, which serves as the passageway for blood vessels and nerve fibers. Now, these osteons are all interconnected here, and we find that they are the structures that make up compact bone. Now, because these osteons contain blood vessels and nerve fibers, it means that bone is highly vascular and highly innervated. So if you break bone, it's going to hurt and it's going to bleed. So the outermost layer of bone is actually what we call periosteum. And the periosteum has two major layers. We have a fibrous layer and a cellular layer here. And the fibrous layer of periosteum is just an outer layer of dense, irregular connective tissue, and it serves as the attachment point for tendons and ligaments. The inner layer of periosteum is made of stem cells, like osteogenic cells and osteoblasts. And the function of these stem cells here is to basically repair and replenish bone if it's broken. Now, the deeper sections of bone are made of spongy bone. And spongy bone is essentially made from the breakdown of compact bone. And so what you're left with is bone that used to be compact, but now has more of a spongy appearance. And it's not broken down randomly. It's actually broken down deliberately by these cells here called osteoclasts. So osteoclasts are the giant multinucleated cells that essentially are immune cell derived, and they effectively break down the bony matrix by secreting lysozymes on it and acid. And it breaks down that bony matrix, releasing calcium into your tissues and into the bloodstream. So there's a dynamic balance then between osteoclasts, which break down bone, and the osteoblasts, which make bone. Now, when osteoblasts become dormant and trapped, you find them within these little spaces in the osteon called a lacuna. And lacuna is basically just a little cavity that these osteocytes live within. And the function of osteocytes, if you zoom in here, you can see that these are osteocytes. And you can see that the function here is basically to monitor and maintain the existing bone. And they're not very active, but they just maintain what bone is there. And they actually set the stimulus for bone remodeling, which is basically, changing the shape of bone. So what we find is that, for the growth of bones, we see that long bones will grow lengthwise at what we call the epiphyseal plate. So the epiphyseal plate is the site of linear bone growth, and this is what I mean by bones growing lengthwise. This occurs during childhood and adolescence. And there's really four zones of growth here at the level of the epiphyseal plate. We have the zone of resting cartilage, proliferating cartilage, maturing, and calcifying cartilage. Now, this is only going to increase the length of bones. So when bones are growing lengthwise, like you're getting taller and limbs are getting longer, we see then that cartilage will divide or proliferate. It matures, and effectively the chondrocytes die. And then that dead cartilage gets calcified. Then that calcified cartilage is remodeled into bone. Now, this only explains lengthwise growth, though. So what we need then in conjunction is a growth in width, which is called appositional bone growth. This is where osteoblasts in the periosteum lay down new bone on the outside of bone, and this actually helps to increase the thickness of bone. Now, the bone cells that are responsible for deposition or bone growth are the osteoblasts, and the osteoclasts are the ones that are involved with bone resorption or breakdown. Now, it turns out that there's different hormones that influence osteoblasts and clasts, and so that there's a dynamic balance of bone homeostasis that's under hormonal control. Now, for those 4 zones of cartilage we find in the epiphyseal plate, this is the metaphysis, which is the center of the end of the long bone, which is the epiphysis, and the diaphysis or shaft. So this is just in the middle here. So here's our growth plate or epiphyseal plate, and it's basically a band of hyaline cartilage that separates the shaft from the end, which is the epiphysis, in a region called the metaphysis. Meta meaning new. Now, what we find here then is a zone of resting cartilage. This will divide into proliferating cartilage that then matures, and then these cells die and can get calcified or mineralized. What we find then is that mineralized cartilage then is remodeled into basically healthy bone. So it's kind of odd to think that your bones and growing lengthwise come from the process of growing in dead cartilage. Now, one interesting aspect of bones is something called Wolff's Law, and it's that bones will grow and remodel based on the stresses that you place on them. So bone is laid down where needed and resorbed when not. And this really adds to our adage of you use it or lose it. So that, if you use a bone a certain way, then it'll get thicker and grow stronger in that region. And if you don't use your bones, then they're resorbed, and the atrophy, just like muscle atrophies due to disuse. So when external forces or loads are placed on the bone, what we find is that, basically our bone mass can increase in those regions, but without external forces, osteoclasts can be greater than osteoblasts, so bone mass can decrease. Now, internal fixation of a fracture can cause a decrease in bone strength because of the fact that, if you don't place stress on a bone, then the bone can atrophy. So one thing that's important to note is that, you want to make sure that your clients are basically using their bones as much as possible, even if they have a bone fracture, within the limits of their pain threshold. And another interesting consideration is that fracture through the epiphyseal plate or growth plate can lead to limb length discrepancy in children. So fracture healing occurs in several key stages. What we find here is that when the bones are fractured, because they're highly vascular, they're going to bleed. So the first stage of bone fracture is hematoma formation. Hematoma is the blood clot, and this is due to leakage of blood out of the vessels and into the bony tissue. And this occurs between 1 and 3 days after the break. After that, though, that we find is that fibrocartilage is what replaces that bone, that clot or hematoma. And this occurs within about 3 days to 2 weeks. Now, what happens next is that cartilage is slowly turned into bone through a process of ossification. And this occurs weeks after the break and months after the break. And that's basically where you're converting this fibrocartilage to bone. And then over the course of years, we get consolidation remodeling where the bone is essentially shaped and formed in a way that best suits how that bone is used. But that's more of a long-term effect, and this could be years. So just summarizing these steps of fracture repair, what we see here then is the hematoma formation. That hematoma is then turned into a fibrocartilaginous callus, which is then turned into a bony callus. And then that bony callus is remodeled over the course of months and years. Now, what we find then is that bones form joints, and the joint is just called an articulation. It's just a place where 2 or more bones meet or articulate and connect. And the joint configuration dictates the possible movement of joints. So what we find is very stable joints that are held together by like fibrous tissue or cartilage are typically not as movable as the least stable joints, which are held together by synovial membrane. So there's a trade-off then between stability and mobility. And the types of joint movement include things like flexion, which is decreasing the angle at the joint, extension, which is increasing the angle, adduction, which is like bringing a structure like a limb closer to their midline, abduction, which is taking it farther away, and rotation, which is rotating it along a certain axis. Now, the 2 categories of joints we have here are synarthroses and diarthroses. There's also amphiarthroses as well, which are slightly movable, but a synarthrosis is a together joint, right? Syn means together, arthrosis is joint. So synarthroses are the non-movable joints that are typically held by fibrous tissue or cartilaginous tissue, so that bones are very strongly held together, and although it's a joint, they are mostly immovable. So these are very stable joints. An example of a fibrous Synarthrosis would be like a sutural joint between your cranial bones. An example of like a cartilaginous synarthrosis could be, basically like your pubic symphysis between the two halves of your pelvis. They're typically very immovable, unless certain structural changes occur. Now, a diarthrosis means a freely movable joint, and it turns out that all diarthroses are synovial joints. So synovial joints are the ones that are held together by synovial tissues and supporting tissues. They're freely movable, but because they're very movable, they're also less stable. If you guys remember the structure of a synovial joint, we see that we have a fibrous capsule that kind of holds the whole joint cavity in place. And then within that joint cavity, we have a synovial membrane that lines the inner surfaces. Now, the synovial membrane is a tissue membrane that basically takes blood plasma, filters it in a way that makes a lubricating synovial fluid that can coat the inner surfaces of this joint. We also find supporting hyaline cartilage within the joint that can cover joint surfaces and help for some cushioning and lubrication. And some accessory structures within synovial joints are ligaments and tendons and menisci and discs. And synovial fluid is basically there to help excessive compression, and it's a lubrication type of fluid. So what this slide has shown is basically just a summary of the synovial joint. So we're seeing the ends of two long bones here. So this is the epiphyseal side of, let's say, like, your humerus. Let's say this is the epiphysis of the radius. And you can see this is basically where they would articulate. And you can see that at the ends of the long bones, we have articular cartilage here. There's actually a little band of hyaline cartilage, not to be confused with the epiphyseal cartilage. This is actually articular cartilage, which is still also hyaline cartilage, but this is more for cushioning. Hyaline cartilage has the consistency of like a hard rubber, so it makes sense you would align the ends of your bones with this hard rubber because it's a nice cushion. Now, what you find then is that between these bones, there's a joint cavity. So synovial joints have a joint cavity which is filled with synovial fluid. The function of this fluid is to basically lubricate and prevent, excessive compression. It's the synovial fluid that fills this cavity. Now, synovial fluid is a highly filtered type of fluid from plasma, and that's actually made from the synovial membrane here, which lines the inner surfaces of this joint cavity. So synovial membrane is a lot like an epithelial tissue, but it effectively filters blood plasma to make synovial fluid. Now, outside of that, we find the fibrous capsule, which is part of the articular capsule. And this fibrous capsule's purpose is to basically serve as a nice little, kind of capsule that holds the whole joint together. What we also find nearby are some supporting tissues like bursa. And the bursa is basically like a balloon of synovial fluid that basically helps to, our synovial membrane, that helps to lubricate between tissues around a joint, like between muscles in the joint, even between muscles, also sometimes between skin and muscle. So that's the function of these bursa here. Now, we can also find supporting ligaments. And so this is an example of, the knee joint. This supporting ligament could be like the medial collateral ligament or the lateral collateral ligament. Basically just supporting ligaments that help to also hold the joint together.